Hello and welcome to this episode of the Digital Disruption Podcast, brought to you by Novus Strategy and Consulting with Pete Gatenby and myself, Chris Williams. Today's episode is all about value stream mapping, and this is a framework that's going to help you and your innovation capabilities, help you to understand where you can leverage digital technology and where about to use it in your organisation to drive innovation and transformation. Value stream mapping then, Pete, it's a topic that we've touched on previously before, but not in any great detail. I think the first thing I'd like to do, if it's okay with you, is just kind of give an overview as to why value stream mapping is relevant before we get into the what is it and how people can use it. So why is it important? Why is it relevant?
Why is it important is really simple. It gives you a full helicopter view, full strategic overview of exactly what it is that is happening in any single process within your organisation, or even actually the overall processes. There's different levels, and we'll get into that in a little bit later. But that's at its core is why it's so important. Once you understand a strategic or helicopter view about what's happening, then of course you can start to identify where improvements can be made, efficiencies can be created, customer experiences can be improved, etc., etc. And it helps us to inform those decisions and actually really focus our attention in the right area of any process, really.
One of the things that stood out for me recently, actually, and earlier this week, I was at the Conveyancing Association conference. And there I saw it too, and that is that organisations today, a lot of businesses, irrelevant of sector in truth, are taking ownership of their own innovation. They kind of they're still turning to vendors to deliver products and certain services, but ultimately they're trying to drive their own innovation and kind of explore the art of the possible themselves. And I think that value stream mapping is a really important framework for organisations to leverage and utilise and understand, so that actually they can do that. So let's get into the sort of the nitty gritty of this. So we've covered why it's relevant. What is it?
So value stream mapping was originally made famous in the lean manufacturing space. We go back to manufacturing lines. Toyota's always the big example, but it's widely adopted across the manufacturing space and now across many industries, whether it's operationally, whether it's in software or product development, it's been adopted. But what it is at its crux is a map of every step in a process that creates value. And so value stream mapping, the name comes from that. You're mapping where the value is going, very much like a stream, so value stream. What you do is essentially take a process or a part of the experience, the customer experience, and you map every single touch point, every single stage. Now, then the example, and this is always the classic example, especially for British people, is a cup of tea, right? So if you were to take a cup of tea and map the value stream map of it making a cup of tea, it's quite simple. Everyone knows the steps, right? You fill the kettle up, you boil the kettle, you get a cup out, you put the tea bag in the cup. Once the water's boiled, and this might be where some debate comes in about when you add the milk, and how long you leave it to stew. Yeah, exactly.
Your own ways.
You add the water, you add the milk, sugar if people want, and then ultimately it's ready for the consumption. Now then, where this really comes into its own is when that process is mapped end to end, you can not only identify what the most efficient route for that process is, as a project manager might do, but actually what you can start to do is you begin to understand where the value or even the cost, either value is created or cost is sunk. So if you take the cup of tea example, boiling the kettle with the perfect amount of water for a single cup of tea, or the amount of cups of tea that you're trying to make, is much more efficient than filling the kettle up to its absolute max. And so when we start to map the value or the cost of that step in the process, you would see that as, well, look, it's costing more money because it's using more energy, using more water, and it's taking longer, and therefore it's stretching out the process end to end. Now then we start to apply that process to customer experience, production processes, software development, and you're mapping these steps, and you very quickly begin to map the cost of the number of people involved in the process, or the end-to-end time, or the value that's created in at that stage, and you map it. Once you understand what's happening at each stage, then you can start to identify where efficiencies can be created, where components within that process can be changed or removed or updated, and you begin to map that out end to end.
So if we looked at this in the context of like the home buying process,
Absolutely, yeah.
and this is where this becomes actually critically important if organisations are trying to understand how or where they can leverage areas of digital technology and digitalisation.
Yeah.
Because if you understand your processes end to end and you've got them mapped out in the way that you've described, you're able to identify where there are efficiency gains, where you could leverage technology to do something. When we move on from there, what that then enables us to do is it enables us to create a roadmap of technology adoption, or basically a list of jobs to be done.
Yeah.
And you can then prioritise those in order of, well, what's the most efficient, what's the the lowest hanging fruit, etc., etc. That's essentially what the outcome of a lot of this stuff is, isn't it?
In our market specifically, it's very interesting because obviously there's a lot of regulation around it, which means actually the process is relatively well defined and well understood by everyone in the market. And what that means is, take the conveyancing process, for example. You mentioned the Conveyancing Association and the event this week, or last week when this goes live. But that conveyancing process is very, very well defined. Now, if that's mapped end to end, then organisations, conveyancing organisations, can look at that process and understand where their cost is, where their efficiencies, where they're potentially losing time or money, and then begin to innovate on those areas.
So let's get into, I guess, how you can use it. So we've talked about what it is. We've talked about kind of why it's relevant. Let's talk more about the how, because I think the big thing for me with anything that we produce, such as these podcasts, is to sort of give people some sort of takeaways. How can they actually go to use this? So I appreciate it's going to be difficult to kind of typically you might be drawing this stuff out, but do you want to talk us through the types of exercises that you would run with organisations, and how that how listeners can, and people watching this, could have a crack at this themselves?
Absolutely, and I will take this away from an industry-wide process now and perhaps put it into how you might do this in an individual internal process that you might have within your organisation, because I think that's going to be more applicable for people listening. Typically how we do this is we get all the main stakeholders who are involved in that process into a room. That'll be boots on the ground, people who are doing the picking up the phones or moving components from one part of the factory to another, or conducting the reviews or documentation if it's in a conveyancing organisation. Whatever that process is that we're looking at. And we bring people in from all stages of the process. And then we begin to have a conversation where we map it, typically on a whiteboard or on a wall that facilities allow us to put sticky notes or blue tack on, because we've all been there. And we don't draw on the wall if it's not a whiteboard wall, because we don't like that either.
Yeah, sorry about that.
But then we map it. We do it physically, and we talk through the process. We as consultants typically play dumb. Now, we often know the process that's being discussed, but we play dumb. We say, well, what happens here? Who's involved? And we begin to build up a complete view of each individual step. And that individual step will go into minute detail of, there are 3 people who touch this. It takes 5 days, and actually there's this piece of software in there, and then we'll estimate the cost as well for each time the process is completed.
So it's a detailed exercise. It's not
Very
something
detailed.
that you quickly necessarily go through, but it's a full step-by-step walkthrough of an end-to-end process.
Absolutely.
With all the necessary people that understand that process, the tooling that's used within it, and that can at least estimate a level of time, effort, and cost around it.
That's it. And by the time you finish, you end up with a nice higgledy-piggledy map, because you've always skipped a few steps and you have to slide things in that can then be drawn up into something that makes absolute sense.
So for people to try to visualise that almost from left to right, starting at the left, you've got,
So if we take the tea example again, you would have on the left, get kettle, fill with water. It takes 10 seconds to fill to the right level. kettle goes on, kettle is switched on, and then it's left to boil for 2 minutes or however long it takes to boil, right? And you would map each stage of this, and you put an estimate on the cost, how many people are involved, and map it from left to right until you've got the cup of tea on the right-hand side.
So in the context of looking at this to try to understand where technology can be leveraged, typically there are, we look at this through the lens of software developers. We're always trying to kind of create flow efficiency. How do we improve the flow of the information going through a process? During the value stream mapping process, how do organizations identify the areas where efficiency or that flow efficiency can be improved, and then what steps can they then take to say, where can we leverage technology? How do they do that?
Well, there's varying different ways on this one in truth. Some are immediately obvious when you go through the process, because almost just talking through it, people realise something's inefficient and they go, well, actually, if we just implement this small process change or operational change, then things will improve. Other times they actually look to the experts within the industry. They come to ourselves and say, well, look, what technology do you know of that exists that can help in some of these processes? Sometimes, and it happens a lot in our industry, right? There's tools that exist, that vendors that are in the market that focus on one part of the process. And so we go, well, look, there's vendor XYZ that do this, and we can slot them into the process. That'll create an efficiency, and the cost is less because we know we've already put a value on that stage of the process. Other times, actually, they're identifying that there might not be technology that exists. There might be a product that needs to be built, and so they need to they can create the efficiency themselves by developing a product and introducing it into the process itself.
And just touching on that for a second, because in the last episode we did, we talked about low code, no code, and actually organizations owning their own innovation capabilities, still looking outside, but also being a master of their own destiny when it comes to some of this stuff. I guess there's a great example of where you could potentially then start to test, because you don't necessarily have to go down the route of a big bang build of some great big huge new product. You could just think, actually, why don't we test something here? I think is the first point. And then the second point is I guess it's quite important to have, if you've got an IT team or something like that, they may not be involved in the process, but maybe to bring them into these sorts of exercises.
That's it. And we always encourage having a cross-representation from across the business in these exercises. If it's not in the initial assessment, sometimes there's a follow-up where you consult with a wider business and you bring in those SME subject matter experts who might know a particular process, or they might know something, or they might be from IT. We bring those people in for that exact reason, to bring their expertise into the process.
The process is obviously one that perhaps is continuously reviewed. One of the lean principles is CI, continuous improvement, which all businesses want to continuously improve. How often, once you've kind of done this exercise, how often would you be recommending to businesses to kind of review this and go back to it? Does it form part of the strategic reviews and operational reviews? Kind of how do you embed this into sort of business practices?
Well, it varies. Often people do this as part of a specific project, but actually we'd recommend that this is value stream mapping exercise of your end-to-end process. How you do what you do is embedded at the strategic innovation level. And what I mean by that is one of the big outcomes of your value stream mapping exercise is that you're selecting a focus of something that's going to be improved. Now, we can go into minute amount of detail here, but there's a scoring exercise that we run with a lot of our clients, and you map the process improvements against the value stream map that's going to basically deliver the biggest improvement for the best cost. In essence, is a cost value exercise that we take place. Now, that should be happening every period at the same level. You're reviewing your strategic objectives and your strategic goals. Now, boards often meet bi-weekly, monthly, sometimes quarterly. I wouldn't do it any slower than quarterly, but periodically, because it's how you identify the next best innovation, what should be focused on next by the organisation, and also how are we doing versus target in terms of improving the end-to-end value stream mapping. And also, you see material improvements when you're constantly updating this map as well, and you can quantify what's being delivered by the innovation teams.
Well, I guess in a sense, ostensibly, you're actually creating a roadmap, aren't you, of prioritised in an order. The other thing is that I guess this touches back to understanding your levels of digital maturity and how that digital maturity can evolve. Because if you benchmarked yourselves or your organisation at a particular point in time, all businesses want to be continuously improving. And we talk about value. There are essentially three types of key business value. You're either doing something to create an efficiency, you're doing something to create a new revenue stream, or you're creating something or changing something in order to increase margin on a particular revenue stream. But actually what you're doing also is this sort of demonstrates the importance of understanding and benchmarking your digital maturity, because you're able to grow. I mean, essentially there are these exercises are all about trying to either drive efficiencies within the organisation, improve customer experience, create new revenue streams. All of these exercises, any of the sort of frameworks and things that we discuss, are all focused on driving out that value. I think my point that I wanted to make just at this sort of point, at this juncture, was this is something that should be embedded, as you quite rightly say. It helps you develop a roadmap, and it's something that you can actually measure and see the improvement and the direct impact, either directly to your business, directly to customer experience. And all of those things are critically important when people are trying to improve and go on that journey of transformation and change. So closing out, what would be your top tips for people watching, listening to this when it comes to value stream mapping? What are your key takeaways?
Mate, we're going to have to name this segment as PG's top tips, I reckon.
I like PG tips. PG tips works.
Yeah. What would my top tips for anyone wanting to undertake this exercise? The first one is there's no wrong answer here. In terms of doing it, you just need to get started. It's actually not a complicated process. In truth, you don't need consultants to come in and do this with you.
You can just get on with it.
You can just get on with it.
You can have a go.
Yeah.
Now, you can by all means ask people to help you facilitate it afterwards, but people should just get going with this.
Absolutely, definitely. You should just be mapping this. Map processes, identify where the value runs through the process, and in truth, the first time you do this, you often eliminate steps that have been in the process very quickly, because everyone goes, well, that step has no value. It's just it's something that was there from a legacy process way back when, and you can quickly rip it out and you can make some really quick wins. Second of all is bring everyone to the table, bring the stakeholders, because you may sit in an operational seat, but you may not be the boots on the ground. Bring the boots on the ground, because the boots on the ground will know exactly how long something takes, where the problems are in it, and will identify much of the opportunity for improvement. Third of all, bring subject matter experts to the table who can tell you about innovations in the market. And in truth, this is where consultants bring a lot of value, and that's where, when we talk to our clients, that's why they value our opinion, because we see the market in a different way. We see we're agnostic, right? We talk to a lot of technology vendors. We work with a lot of technology vendors. We work with people across the industry, and so we bring knowledge that when you're from within an organisation that does one thing within the home buying space. Perhaps you're a conveyancer, perhaps you're a lender. You don't necessarily see it from the other side as to why something is the way it is. Or actually, you might not see the technology that's is coming onto the radar of everyone's plans at the moment, and so that's really where the value comes in. So they're my three things: get going, don't worry about getting it wrong. You're unlikely to get it wrong. Bring the doers to the table, and then invite SMEs.
I'm going to add a fourth for you.
Ooh.
And I think this is one that we've seen before that doesn't always come to the fore, but it is important. Put time aside to do it properly. So don't rush through it. Put the right time aside. And I think the right time really is at least sort of half a day, subject to the size of your organisation. But that fourth one for me is time. Put the right time aside.
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. It's fun as well. I actually really enjoy doing the value stream mapping. because you always learn something interesting about the process that you didn't know before. So it's never time wasted.
Well, that concludes today's episode of the Digital Disruption Podcast, all about value stream mapping. If there's anything specific from this episode that you've got any questions on, as ever, don't hesitate to reach out to us, specifically to Pete, via LinkedIn or usual channels, and ask any questions that you may have. But for now, thanks for tuning in, listening or watching, and we'll see you again next week.
Thank you.